The day they buried my creek, they also buried the future of their own neighborhood. They just didn't know it yet. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the roar of the concrete trucks. It was the silence. My creek had always greeted the sunrise with the soft murmur of moving water, a sound my grandfather used to call the heartbeat of this valley. But as I stepped onto my back porch with a mug of black coffee warming my hands, that familiar sound had vanished beneath the grinding growl of diesel engines and the steady metallic clatter of chutes swinging into place. The smell hit me next. Wet cement, hot exhaust, and fresh earth mixed into a thick cloud that hung over the property like a storm that had forgotten how to rain. I set my coffee down before I dropped it. 3 white concrete mixers sat along the property line where the creek curved behind the trees. Workers in reflective vests were guiding a gray river of concrete straight into the channel that had carried clean spring water across this land for generations. It flowed over smooth stones, swallowed patches of green moss, and slowly erased the creek as if it had never existed. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 41 years old, a civil engineer specializing in drainage systems and watershed restoration. Most people spend their careers figuring out how to control water. My grandfather spent his teaching me the opposite. Respect water, he always said while we walked these banks together. You'll never beat it. The best you can do is understand where it wants to go. Those words echoed louder than the trucks as I crossed the pasture, my boots crunching over dry gravel that still held the cool air from the night before. By the time I reached the fence, the HOA president was already waiting for me with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a smile polished enough to belong on a real estate billboard. Brenda Whitmore looked perfectly at home in pressed white slacks and oversized sunglasses despite standing beside a construction zone. She didn't even glance at the creek disappearing beneath thousands of pounds of concrete. To her, it was just another obstacle removed from the master plan. "Morning, Ethan," she called cheerfully. "Beautiful day for progress, isn't it?" I looked past her toward the fresh concrete slowly filling every bend of the stream. "That creek drains this entire valley," I said evenly. "You can't just seal it." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Actually, we can. County approved our beautification project last month. We're eliminating an ugly drainage ditch and creating more usable green space for the community." Drainage ditch. I almost smiled at the choice of words. My grandfather dug test wells here in the 1970s. I'd studied geological surveys before I was old enough to drive. That ditch was the natural overflow channel protecting nearly 200 acres from turning into saturated ground every rainy season. The workers kept pouring while Brenda spoke, and every second the creek disappeared farther beneath a smooth gray ribbon that gleamed in the morning sun. Behind her, the rooftops of Willow Ridge Estates stretched across the hillside, rows of million-dollar homes with stone facades, decorative fountains, and perfectly trimmed lawns. New money built on old ground. The air felt strangely heavy, almost weighting. I noticed survey stakes scattered near the construction site, several already leaning at odd angles in the damp soil. Nobody else seemed to care. They were celebrating. A photographer snapped pictures for the HOA newsletter while a few homeowners applauded from their golf carts, convinced they were watching another expensive neighborhood improvement. Brenda adjusted her sunglasses and folded her arms. "This will increase everyone's property values," she said proudly. "Sometimes nature needs a little organization." I looked once more at the last ribbon of clear water slipping beneath the advancing wall of concrete until it vanished completely. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply watched the final section disappear beneath fresh cement while the smell of wet concrete settled over the valley. Because standing there, with every lesson my grandfather had ever taught me running through my head, I realized something none of them understood. They thought they had buried a creek. What they had really buried was the only thing keeping the ground beneath their dream neighborhood alive. 18 years before those concrete trucks rolled onto my land, my grandfather stood beside that same creek wearing faded denim overalls and a weathered straw hat, holding a shovel in one hand and pointing toward the water with the other. I was just a teenager then, more interested in fishing than engineering, but he insisted I pay attention. "The creek is not the important part," he told me. "It is what the creek does that matters." At the time, I thought he was talking about keeping the cattle watered or giving deer a place to drink. It took college, thousands of hours studying hydrology, and years designing drainage systems across Texas before I finally understood what he meant. Water never travels alone. It carries pressure, weight, history, and consequences. Our family bought this property in 1958 when the valley was still ranch country. Back then there were no gated entrances, no stone monuments, and certainly no million-dollar houses perched on carefully landscaped lots. There were oak trees, limestone shelves, tall grass that reached my knees every summer, and that winding creek quietly following the same path it had carved for centuries. My grandfather never tried to straighten it. He never lined it with concrete or forced it into pipes. He believed the land already knew what it was doing long before people arrived with blueprints. When he passed away, the property came to me along with every survey, every notebook, and every yellowed map he had collected over 4 decades. Most people inherit money or jewelry. I inherited elevation charts, soil reports, rainfall journals, and hand-drawn sketches showing exactly how water moved through every acre after storms of different sizes. Those boxes filled an entire wall inside my workshop, and while friends joked that I had inherited the world's most boring library, I treated every page like family history. As an engineer, I had spent nearly 2 decades helping cities prevent flooding, stabilize creek banks, and repair roads damaged by shifting soil. I knew how expensive it became when someone ignored nature instead of working with it. Ironically, many of my biggest projects involved fixing mistakes made by developers who believed concrete solved every problem. Every failed retaining wall, every cracked parking lot, every sinking subdivision began with someone deciding that water should obey human schedules instead of gravity. Willow Ridge Estates had arrived only 4 years earlier. The advertisements promised luxury country living surrounded by preserved natural beauty, although every month another section of woods disappeared beneath bulldozers and freshly poured foundations. Brenda Whitmore loved calling it progress. I called it optimism built on incomplete homework. We had crossed paths several times before the creek incident. She had sent letters asking me to trim native trees because they blocked premium views from neighboring lots. She complained about the sound of frogs during spring evenings, insisting prospective buyers preferred peaceful silence. She even suggested filling part of my pond because standing water looked neglected. Every conversation ended the same way. I politely declined, and she walked away convinced I simply hated change. The truth was much simpler. I understood this valley in ways no architectural rendering ever could. Every bend in that creek existed for a reason. Every patch of cattails slowed runoff. Every shallow overflow channel relieved pressure before heavy rain reached the lower basin. None of those features looked impressive on a sales brochure, but together they formed a system more reliable than anything engineers could build with unlimited budgets. As the afternoon sun reflected off the fresh concrete sealing the creek, I returned to my workshop and opened one of my grandfather's old filing cabinets. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, while the familiar smell of aged paper and cedar filled the room. I pulled out a rolled topographic map dated 1976 and spread it across my workbench. Thin blue lines traced the creek from the northern ridge all the way through the valley exactly as it had flowed for generations. I rested my hand on the faded paper and quietly followed the route with my finger until it reached the subdivision, now standing where open pasture once breathed after every storm. For the first time that day, I was not angry. I was deeply concerned. Because maps do not care about optimism, and neither does water. The following week the construction crews came back with bigger equipment, and it became painfully clear that sealing the creek had only been the beginning. Every morning I woke to the sharp reverse beeping of loaders, the steady hiss of hydraulic arms, and the deep rumble of bulldozers climbing the hillside. The smell of fresh asphalt gradually replaced the scent of cedar and damp soil that had always drifted through my open windows. Willow Ridge Estates was expanding again, and Brenda Whitmore treated every new foundation like another trophy. She held neighborhood tours from golf carts decorated with little HOA flags, proudly explaining how the next phase would include luxury homes overlooking what she called the new community greenbelt. I almost laughed every time I heard that phrase because the so-called greenbelt was sitting directly above the natural drainage basin the creek had protected for decades. One Saturday morning, Brenda drove onto the edge of my property without so much as asking permission. Her polished white sport utility vehicle rolled slowly across the gravel, while expensive perfumes somehow overpowered the smell of construction dust each time she stepped out. She removed her sunglasses with theatrical confidence and smiled as though we were old friends. "Ethan," she said, "you should really consider selling the rest of your acreage. Imagine how much easier life would be if everything around here matched." I leaned against the fence and looked beyond her toward another row of framed houses rising above freshly graded soil. "Everything matched what?" I asked. She spread her arms toward the subdivision. "Progress. Families. Property values. People want clean lines, organized landscaping, and modern drainage. Nobody wants an old creek wandering through the woods anymore." I let the silence answer before speaking. That creek was the drainage. She gave a patient smile usually reserved for correcting children. "You engineers always overcomplicate things. We hired professionals. They said concrete is permanent." Permanent. The word lingered in my mind long after she drove away. Nature had a habit of embarrassing people who believed anything on earth was permanent. Over the next several weeks, I watched truck after truck deliver filled dirt into low areas that had once flooded harmlessly during heavy rain. Decorative stone walls appeared where water had naturally spread across the valley floor. Landscapers planted rows of expensive ornamental trees with shallow root systems where native grasses had anchored the soil for generations. Every decision looked beautiful in photographs. Every decision ignored how the land actually functioned. The strangest part was that the homeowners loved it. They complimented Brenda during board meetings for transforming and used land into premium real estate. They applauded each announcement about rising home values. One evening, I attended an open community meeting after receiving an invitation addressed to all neighboring property owners. Inside the clubhouse, the air smelled of fresh paint and vanilla candles, while framed artist renderings covered the walls. A large display board showed the completed neighborhood with bright blue ponds, walking trails, and perfectly green lawns. The original creek was nowhere on the map. During the presentation, I quietly raised my hand and asked one simple question. "Where does stormwater go after a 10-inch rainfall?" The room became unusually quiet. Brenda answered without hesitation. "Our engineers accounted for everything." I nodded politely. "Can I see the drainage model?" Several people exchanged confused looks. One board member shuffled papers without finding anything. Brenda quickly stepped between me and the display. "Those technical reports are proprietary development documents." Her answer told me everything I needed to know. Either no comprehensive model existed, or she assumed nobody would ever ask to see it. As I walked back to my truck beneath a sky glowing orange with the last light of day, a warm breeze carried the dry smell of disturbed clay across the valley. I stopped beside the old fence and looked toward the hidden creek, now trapped beneath thousands of pounds of concrete. For just a moment, I noticed something almost everyone else had missed. Water was beginning to seep through the edge of the newly graded hillside, leaving several dark patches in the otherwise pale soil. They were small enough to ignore. Small enough that nobody celebrating luxury homes would even notice them. But I did. Water was already searching for another way home. The next morning, I began doing what engineers do when something feels wrong. I gathered evidence instead of opinions. Before the sun burned away the thin layer of fog across the valley, I walked every foot of the old creek bed with a survey rod, a notebook, and a camera. The damp smell of clay lingered in the cool air, but something else caught my attention. Water was already collecting beneath the fresh concrete, instead of flowing through the channel. Tiny puddles shimmered beside the newly graded slopes, reflecting the morning light like scattered mirrors. They looked harmless. To me, they looked like pressure with nowhere to go. I photographed everything. Every crack beginning to form around the poured concrete. Every dark patch of saturated soil. Every construction marker leaning a little farther than it had the day before. By noon, I was sitting inside the county engineering office with a folder thick enough to fill an entire desk. The building smelled of old paper, printer toner, and burned coffee. A county engineer listened politely while flipping through my photographs. He admitted the drainage changes looked unusual, but after checking his computer, he gave me the answer I had expected. The development had approved permits. The inspections were current. Unless obvious property damage had already occurred, there was very little the county could do. I thanked him for his time because arguing would accomplish nothing. The following stop was the environmental office. I explained that a natural drainage channel had been permanently blocked. The representative nodded, accepted copies of my documentation, and promised the agency would review the project when resources became available. The waiting list, she explained with an apologetic smile, could take several months. Several months. I looked out the office window toward gathering clouds on the western horizon and silently wondered whether the weather would wait that long. Even my attorney offered little encouragement. His office overlooked downtown, all polished glass and expensive furniture that smelled faintly of leather and cedar polish. After reviewing the permits, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You probably have a case," he admitted, "but proving long-term drainage negligence before actual damages occur is difficult. Litigation could take years." Years. Everyone measured time in paperwork. I measured it in rainstorms. Meanwhile, Brenda seemed to enjoy every one of my failed attempts. A few days later, another glossy newsletter appeared in my mailbox celebrating the remarkable progress of Phase 2. The cover showed smiling families standing beside decorative stone walkways built exactly where seasonal overflow water had once spread safely across the valley. One paragraph proudly described the elimination of an outdated natural drainage feature to create more usable community space. I almost admired the confidence it took to print those words. Around town, the story gradually shifted against me. A few homeowners began referring to me as the stubborn neighbor who refused to embrace modernization. One local real estate agent joked during a community breakfast that engineers always expected disaster because that was how they stayed employed. I smiled politely and finished my coffee without responding. Experience had taught me that facts rarely win arguments before consequences arrive. That evening, I returned to the workshop and pinned every new photograph beside my grandfather's old topographic map. The timeline was beginning to tell its own story. Survey stakes leaning farther each week. Damp soil spreading beyond the construction zone. Hairlines settling along freshly poured sidewalks. None of it was dramatic enough to alarm anyone else, but every image fit together like pieces of a puzzle. I switched on my weather station, downloaded the latest seasonal forecast, and watched a series of moisture systems slowly forming across the Gulf. Meteorologists predicted an unusually wet spring. I closed the laptop, listened to the distant chorus of tree frogs beginning another evening, and realized something important. I had done everything the proper way. I had warned the people responsible. I had documented every decision. If nature decided to continue writing the rest of the report, there would be no debate about who had ignored the evidence. 3 days later, I unlocked a dusty steel cabinet in the far corner of my workshop, one my grandfather had always called the history drawer. The old hinges groaned as if they had not been opened in years, releasing the familiar scent of cedar, faded blueprints, and yellowed paper. Most people would have seen stacks of forgotten documents. I saw decades of careful observation waiting to speak. I spread every survey across the workbench until the entire surface disappeared beneath contour lines, handwritten notes, rainfall records, and geological cross-sections. The oldest map dated back to 1959, when the county still surveyed land by hand instead of satellite. My grandfather had added notes in neat pencil over the years, documenting every unusually wet spring, every dry summer, and every place where groundwater surfaced after heavy storms. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Soft peat basin begins below limestone shelf. Creek relieves underground pressure. I had read those words years earlier, but now they carried an entirely different meaning. I reached for a modern geological survey stored in one of my engineering project files and carefully laid it beside my grandfather's map. The outlines matched almost perfectly. Willow Ridge Estates had been built directly across the old peat basin. The decorative lake, the walking trails, and more than 30 luxury homes all rested on soil that had remained stable only because the creek constantly carried excess groundwater away from the valley floor. Without that natural outlet, the moisture had nowhere to escape. It would simply spread beneath the surface until the ground softened from below. I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. The air inside the workshop suddenly seemed unusually still. Outside, a mockingbird landed on the fence near the sealed creek, singing exactly as it had every spring since I was a child. Nature itself had not changed. Only the people pretending they understood it had. I spent the rest of the afternoon comparing elevation models with rainfall projections from the National Weather Service. Every calculation reached the same conclusion. It did not matter whether the valley received 6 inches of rain or 12. The timeline might change slightly, but the outcome remained identical. Groundwater pressure would rise beneath the subdivision until the saturated peat began compressing under the weight of foundations, driveways, and roads. The process would be slow at first, almost impossible to notice. Then it would accelerate. Concrete does not float on mud forever. For the first time since the construction began, I understood the full picture. This was never about a blocked creek alone. The creek had been the valley's pressure relief valve. Removing it had transformed the entire hillside into a sealed container slowly filling from below. Nobody standing on those perfectly manicured lawns could see what was happening beneath their feet, but the ground already knew. I rolled every map into protective tubes, scanned each handwritten journal into digital copies, and backed every file onto multiple hard drives. Then I organized photographs, weather data, survey measurements, and county permit records into chronological folders. If questions ever came, I wanted every answer waiting before anyone asked. Late that evening, I walked back toward the old creek one more time. The concrete surface reflected the fading orange sky, while tiny beads of water seeped through narrow joints near the edges. I crouched beside one damp patch and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. Instead of feeling firm resistance, the ground yielded softly beneath my hand like a soaked sponge. I stood quietly, brushed the damp clay from my fingertips, and looked toward the glowing windows of the expensive homes overlooking the valley. Families were eating dinner. Children were riding bicycles along freshly poured sidewalks and porch. Lights flickered on one by one. They believed they had purchased security, beauty, and permanence. None of them realized the most important part of the neighborhood had disappeared beneath concrete weeks earlier, and the valley had already begun its patient, invisible search for another path. From that day forward, I stopped trying to convince anyone. I stopped attending HOA meetings, stopped responding to Brenda's cheerful newsletters, and stopped wasting time explaining groundwater to people who believed landscaping brochures carried more authority than geology. Instead, I documented everything with the same discipline my grandfather had taught me decades earlier. Every sunrise, I walked the property carrying a camera, a moisture meter, and a notebook. The air changed a little more each morning. The sharp scent of dry limestone slowly gave way to the earthy smell of damp soil. Even though there had not been a significant storm in weeks, the ground was quietly changing from underneath. I installed 2 motion-activated trail cameras overlooking the sealed creek, not because I expected vandalism, but because I wanted a continuous visual record of the site. I also launched my small survey drone every Saturday morning, flying the exact same route at the exact same altitude. From above, tiny details became impossible to ignore. Patches of unusually green grass began appearing along the edge of the buried creek. Decorative shrubs planted only weeks earlier leaned ever so slightly downhill. Near the newest row of homes, several backyards stayed damp long after the sprinklers had stopped running. None of it looked dramatic enough to concern anyone else. To me, every image confirmed the same quiet conclusion. Water had already begun choosing another path. I organized every photograph by date and overlaid them with weather records, soil moisture readings, and elevation measurements. My computer gradually filled with folders named after calendar weeks instead of emotions. Evidence never gets angry. It simply accumulates. I even hired an independent licensed surveyor, not to challenge the development, but to establish baseline elevations across my property line. When he finished reviewing the area, he looked toward the subdivision with a puzzled expression. "Strange place to build this much weight," he muttered while packing away his equipment. "Feels softer than I expected." I simply thanked him and filed away another report. A few days later, I mailed certified copies of my documentation to the county engineering office, the environmental agency, and the developer's project manager. The letters were respectful, factual, and completely free of accusations. I outlined the historical drainage pattern, attached copies of geological surveys, included photographs documenting groundwater seepage, and recommended an independent review before the spring rainy season. Every envelope contained the same sentence near the end. "This correspondence is intended solely to preserve the historical record and encourage preventative evaluation. I was not threatening anyone. I was making sure nobody could later claim they had never been informed. The responses arrived over the following weeks. Most thanked me for my concerns and assured me the development remained compliant with existing approvals. One letter explained that future inspections would occur according to the normal schedule. Another reminded me that licensed contractors had completed the drainage modifications. Brenda, of course, treated the entire situation as another victory. During a neighborhood open house, I overheard her telling prospective buyers that a few longtime landowners simply struggled to accept progress. She laughed politely while guests admired stone entryways and freshly planted flower beds. I kept driving without stopping. There was nothing left to debate. The forecast finally shifted near the end of March. Dark blue bands began appearing across every regional weather map, each update predicting a slower, wetter spring than normal. Meteorologists spoke about saturated air moving inland from the Gulf and repeated chances of prolonged rainfall over several weeks. One cool evening, I stood beside the old fence as the wind carried the distant smell of approaching rain across the valley. High clouds drifted silently overhead while the first drops tapped against the leaves of the old oak trees my grandfather had planted long before Willow Ridge Estates existed. I slipped my notebook into my jacket, looked once more toward the perfectly landscaped neighborhood glowing beneath porch lights, and quietly realized that my work was finished. I had not built a trap. I had simply recorded every moment before nature began correcting someone else's mistake. The rain did not arrive all at once. It settled over the valley with quiet determination, beginning as a steady drizzle that tapped against my workshop roof through the night. By the third day, the familiar scent of cedar had blended with the rich smell of soaked earth, and every low spot across my pasture shimmered beneath a blanket of gray clouds. My weather station logged rainfall hour after hour, exactly as the seasonal forecasts had predicted. Nothing about the storm was extraordinary. In fact, by local standards, it was simply a healthy spring rain. That was precisely what worried me. I drove the perimeter of my property each morning, stopping at the same survey markers I had photographed for weeks. The moisture readings climbed steadily, but my land behaved exactly as it always had. Water collected briefly in shallow depressions before slowly disappearing into the natural drainage network that my grandfather had protected for decades. Then I looked uphill toward Willow Ridge Estates. At first, the changes were subtle. A decorative walking path developed a shallow dip near one of the stone retaining walls. Fresh mulch floated away from carefully landscaped flower beds. Small puddles lingered beneath expensive ornamental trees long after the rain had stopped. Homeowners blamed clogged sprinklers, faulty drainage pipes, or careless landscapers. Nobody suspected the ground itself. A week later, the drizzle returned, followed by another slow-moving system that blanketed the valley for 4 more days. The sound of rain became constant, soft enough to ignore until silence itself felt unfamiliar. My trail cameras recorded water seeping from the edges of the buried creek in dozens of tiny locations. It never burst through the concrete. It simply emerged beside it, searching for the route that generations of engineers and nature had already established. My drone flights revealed something even more revealing. Lawns that had once appeared perfectly level now showed faint depressions stretching across multiple backyards. From ground level, they were almost invisible. From the air, they formed a winding pattern that matched the original creek channel almost exactly. The valley was quietly redrawing the map everyone thought they had erased. Then came the phone calls. A homeowner posted photographs online showing a cracked backyard patio. Another complained that her fence gate no longer closed properly. Someone else blamed a contractor after noticing that one corner of a newly poured driveway had settled by nearly an inch. Brenda responded confidently, assuring residents that minor settling was completely normal in new developments. Contractors filled small cracks with sealant, adjusted doors, and regraded sections of landscaping. Cosmetic repairs covered cosmetic symptoms. None of them addressed what continued happening beneath the surface. By the middle of April, the decorative pond near the neighborhood entrance refused to hold its designed water level. Ironically, the surrounding ground remained constantly saturated. Walking paths squished beneath expensive running shoes, and golf carts left shallow tire impressions where firm soil had existed only weeks earlier. The air carried the unmistakable scent of wet clay even on sunny afternoons. I stood quietly beside my old fence one evening as frogs returned to areas where they had been absent since the creek disappeared. Their chorus echoed across the valley while red-winged blackbirds gathered around new patches of standing water forming behind several homes. Wildlife recognized the changing landscape long before people did. I opened my notebook and compared the latest drone photographs with my grandfather's hand-drawn drainage map. Every dark patch of saturated ground lined up with his pencil marks from nearly 50 years earlier. The water had not disappeared when the creek was buried. It had simply gone underground, patiently reclaiming the route it had always intended to follow. Looking across the hillside at rows of elegant homes glowing beneath warm porch lights, I realized the most remarkable part of the entire situation. Nature had not become angry. It had not rushed. It had not taken revenge. It was simply restoring balance one slow inch at a time, and with every passing day, the valley itself was becoming the evidence no expert witness could ever dispute. By early May, the neighborhood no longer sounded like a luxury development. The cheerful hum of lawn mowers had been replaced by the steady whine of foundation inspectors, utility crews, and survey equipment. Every morning, another pickup truck arrived carrying someone with a clipboard and a laser level. The air smelled of damp concrete instead of fresh-cut grass, and the perfectly clean sidewalks now carried thin ribbons of dried mud tracked in by contractors trying to understand why brand-new homes no longer sat exactly where they had only weeks before. My phone rang just after sunrise on a Tuesday. It was the county engineering office. The same engineer who had politely listened to my concerns months earlier sounded noticeably different. Calm, but serious. He asked whether I still had copies of the historical surveys I had mentioned during our first meeting. I told him I had everything organized by date, including photographs, drone imagery, rainfall logs, groundwater observations, and copies of every certified letter I had mailed. There was a brief silence before he simply replied, "We would like to review all of it." That afternoon, 3 county engineers walked beside me along the buried creek while I explained nothing beyond documented facts. I showed them the original topographic surveys, my grandfather's field notes, the geological reports identifying the Peat Basin, and the aerial photographs revealing how new surface depressions perfectly matched the original creek alignment. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. One engineer knelt beside the damp soil, where groundwater continued seeping around the concrete barrier. He pressed a steel probe into the earth with almost no effort before quietly looking at the others. They did not need many words. The evidence was speaking for itself. Within days, additional agencies became involved. Independent geotechnical consultants drilled soil borings throughout the subdivision, while environmental specialists reviewed drainage modifications against historical watershed maps. Temporary orange survey flags appeared across front yards where decorative landscaping had stood only months earlier. Residents gathered in small groups near mailboxes, watching crews measure sidewalks that no longer sat level. Rumors spread faster than official reports. Some blamed poor construction. Others suspected defective concrete. A few insisted the unusual weather was responsible. Brenda continued assuring everyone that minor settlement was common in new developments. But confidence became harder to maintain each time another driveway required repair or another retaining wall developed fresh separation lines. Then the preliminary engineering findings became public. The report did not describe an unavoidable natural disaster. It described an avoidable design failure. The investigation concluded that the original drainage channel had functioned as a critical groundwater relief system for the valley. By permanently sealing it without providing equivalent subsurface drainage, excess groundwater gradually saturated the underlying peat deposits, reducing their load-bearing capacity beneath portions of the development. Reading those words, I felt no satisfaction, only quiet confirmation. Everything my grandfather had written in faded pencil decades earlier had been proven correct by modern engineering. A week later, Brenda finally knocked on my front door. For the first time since I had known her, there was no polished confidence in her expression. She stood silently on the porch while a cool breeze carried the familiar smell of wet earth across the pasture. Her eyes drifted toward the old creek before returning to me. "Could this have been prevented?" she asked softly. I thought about every conversation we had shared, every warning politely dismissed, every report ignored, and every opportunity to stop before concrete buried the valley's natural heartbeat. I answered with complete honesty. Yes, long before the first truck arrived. Neither of us spoke again for several moments. Somewhere beyond the trees, hidden beneath tons of hardened concrete, water continued its patient journey beneath the ground, following the same path it had chosen centuries before anyone imagined building luxury homes above it. The final report was released just before the beginning of summer, and by then the valley looked nothing like the glossy brochures that had once promised perfect suburban living. Construction fencing surrounded sections of the neighborhood, while engineers marked dozens of locations with bright orange paint. Heavy equipment returned, not to build, but to investigate. The sound that now echoed across the hillside was not celebration, but the steady rhythm of drilling rigs extracting soil samples from beneath roads, sidewalks, and front yards. Every core they removed told the same story. Water had quietly reclaimed the ground below. Within a month, the county ordered a comprehensive drainage restoration plan before additional construction could continue. Independent consultants recommended reopening the historic drainage corridor and installing a modern groundwater relief system that respected the valley's original watershed instead of fighting it. Ironically, the safest solution required bringing back much of what had existed before anyone poured the first load of concrete. Crews eventually arrived with demolition equipment designed for precision work. They carefully removed long sections of the hardened channel, exposing soil that had remained hidden for months. The first time clear water appeared beneath the broken concrete, I stood silently near the old fence. It did not rush forward with dramatic force. It simply emerged, cool and steady, slipping through gravel exactly where my grandfather's maps had always shown it would. The familiar sound returned one gentle ripple at a time, filling the quiet morning air with a melody I had missed since the day it disappeared. Brenda resigned as HOA president before the restoration project was completed. I never celebrated her departure because this had never been about defeating a person. Pride had been the real opponent from the beginning. Pride ignored maps. Pride dismissed history. Pride assumed expensive plans could replace generations of local knowledge. Several homeowners eventually stopped by my property over the following weeks. Some apologized for dismissing my concerns. Others simply thanked me for preserving records that helped investigators understand what had happened. I welcomed every conversation without bitterness. Most of those families had trusted the experts hired to protect their investment. They were never my enemies. One quiet evening after the last restoration crew packed up their equipment, I walked the length of the reopened creek carrying the same weathered notebook my grandfather once carried through these fields. The air smelled of fresh grass again instead of wet concrete. Dragonflies skimmed across the water while frogs called from the reeds that had already begun returning along the banks. Nature had wasted no time reclaiming what belonged to it. I stopped beneath the old oak tree where my grandfather first explained that water was never something to conquer. I could almost hear his voice drifting through the rustling leaves. Respect it. Learn from it. Let it do the work it has always done. Looking downstream, I watched the current curve gently through the valley before disappearing behind the trees toward land that would outlive every neighborhood, every blueprint, and every argument. My drone, my photographs, my measurements, and my reports had all played their part, but none of them delivered justice. They simply preserved the truth until the truth became impossible to ignore. As the evening sun reflected across the moving water, I closed my notebook and smiled to myself. Concrete can silence a creek for a season, but it cannot erase the memory of the land. Water never forgets where it belongs, and sooner or later, neither does justice.